Welcome to the next Mind of War video. In this video we're going to touch on Herodotus, who is considered the father of history, predates Thucydides, and is an important Greek author. He captures a lot of interesting battles and critical battles between the Persians and the Greeks, and we're going to focus on that. In 480 BC, the king of Persia, Xerxes, got together a massive army, some say up to 1 million, maybe beyond, and navy, and marched on Greece. Now, one of the things that was interesting about this was that the king of Persia had the opportunity to understand the Greeks, but always, as captured by Herodotus, struggled to get his head around the nature of his adversary, the nature of the enemy, and what that enemy meant to him and his own forces if he was trying to conquer Greece. Reviewing his assembled force and impressed by the magnificence and size of this massive army and navy, King Xerxes, as captured in Herodotus, calls for Demaratus. Now, Demaratus was an exiled Spartan king who fought alongside Xerxes, and Xerxes looks to him for advice. He has reflected on the magnificence and massive size of this army and navy, and he looks to Demaratus for advice in terms of who on earth would stand up against a force like mine. And Demaratus starts with a question when asked by Xerxes, when summoned by Xerxes to give his perspective. And Demaratus says to him, "Is it a true answer or a pleasant one?" And this is a critical question. We can see throughout millennia this idea of speaking truth to power. It's always a risk in speaking to senior leaders and kings or military commanders, and the preference, as shown throughout history, is to tell a leader what they want to hear, rather than speaking truth to power and providing an uncomfortable answer. And I've spoken on this elsewhere in an article I published in War on the Rocks titled Self-Deception and the Conspiracy of Optimism. And it's fundamentally important, as I argue, that leaders actually develop an environment where their subordinates can speak truth to power. Now, Xerxes turns to Demaratus and says, "Look, tell me the truth. It won't go badly with you." So Demaratus reflects. He says, "Look, I'll speak to you about the Spartans, because kind of that's what he knows, but also they were important in terms of a force that Xerxes would have to face." And Demaratus argues that it doesn't matter how big your force is, the Spartans will fight you and will fight you to their death. So it doesn't matter how many Spartans there are, whether there's 1,000 taking on you, whether there's less or whether there's more, they will fight you until they die. And Xerxes kind of laughs and sends Demaratus away going, "Yeah, okay, whatever." Very dismissive, as Herodotus captures. But then other events start to transpire. So the now famous force by Lionitis and his kind of 300 mainly Spartans who went to the pass of Thermopylae and blocked it so that the Persians would have to fight them to get through. And so as Xerxes is moving his army through, he comes up across Lionitis Force, and he sends out a spy, and the spy comes back and says, well, they're preparing to die. They are preparing for war, they're not going anywhere. And Xerxes, again, struggling to understand this adversary he's coming up against, calls again for Demaratus. And Demaratus comes and he says, "Look, I spoke to you last time, I gave you an honest opinion, and I will give you an honest perspective again." And Xerxes explains the situation, and Demaratus says, "They are getting ready to fight you and die. They are not going to back down. They will fight you and they will die." And again, Xerxes just can't believe it. So Xerxes waits with his forces for 4 days. And Herodotus describes this scene as Xerxes is waiting, expecting the Greeks to run away or make their escape, and they don't move. Lionitis Force is going to fight. So on the 5th day, Xerxes throws his forces against Lionitis' small force. And the result is that they begin to lose a lot of the Persian army, are killed. And Herodotus makes an observation that it becomes pretty obvious to anybody, including Xerxes, that he might have a large number in his army, but he actually has very few soldiers. Now Xerxes, as we know, eventually overcomes Lionitis' force, but wins the battle, loses the war, and in 1 year later is heading home in defeat from Greece, with both losses to his army and losses to his navy. And Herodotus captures this idea that an enemy is actually difficult to understand, particularly if you're dismissive of it. And there's an interesting modern day insight into this enduring problem and challenge of understanding the adversary. And that's captured in a fantastic documentary called The Fog of War, which looks at a series of interviews with former US Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And McNamara was in charge during much of the Vietnam War. And after the Vietnam War, McNamara actually goes back to Vietnam. So in 1995, some 2 decades afterwards, trying to still get his head around this strategic defeat by US forces and the incredible conflict that took place. And he describes an interview he had with a former Vietnamese foreign minister, and I'll read that because it's profound, and you can see as McNamara recounts his discussion with the foreign minister Trua, the impact it had on him. And Trua says to him, this Vietnamese foreign minister says, "Mr. McNamara, you must never have read a history book. If you had, you'd know we weren't pawns of the Chinese or the Russians. McNamara, didn't you know that? Don't you understand that we've been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years? We were fighting for our independence, and we would fight to the last man, and we were determined to do so. And no amount of bombing, no amount of US pressure would ever have stopped us." And you can see McNamara reflecting on this and the challenge and difficulty, and looking back, realizing that the US had never understood the Vietnamese in terms of at least the US Defense Secretary and that US senior leadership. They'd never understood the Vietnamese, why they were fighting, or how they had perceived the Vietnam War. And so I think there's some takeaways, again, that run through this enduring aspect of the human element in conflict. And in this, leaders need to actively encourage feedback, whether it's what they want to hear or not, and then actually use it. Xerxes wasted that intelligence and that insight he had because he couldn't get his head around the idea that the adversary was very different to what he knew and what he expected. The adversary is different to you, and trying to understand the adversary is fundamental in any conflict, albeit incredibly difficult. And the final point is that we saw it's not the numbers in the fight, it was actually the fight in the numbers, as Xerxes found out as he threw his enormous forces against this small Lionitis force and watched them get decimated, ultimately prevailing in the battle but losing the war. And I think there's some important points to take away.